They never show you this in the movies. They give you the feasts, the drinking horns, the roaring fires, and the warriors drenched in glory. But what they don't show you is the shadow behind the torches, the part of Viking ritual that was darker than war itself. The truth that women, queens, and slaves alike were bound into ceremonies of blood and fire, their bodies turned into offerings, their voices silenced beneath the chanting of men. Some were revered as seeress, whispering with the gods. Others were sacrificed, bound in chains, their screams masked by drums. This is the forbidden history of Viking rituals, and the women whose roles in them were far more terrifying than legend dares to admit. The year is 921, and an Arab diplomat named Ahmed ibn Fadlan steps onto the banks of the Volga River. He is far from his home in Baghdad, sent as an emissary to the land of the Rus, Viking traders and raiders who have carved a path deep into the east. What he sees will shake him, and centuries later, his words will remain one of the only eyewitness accounts of Viking ritual in its raw, unflinching detail. The Rus, descendants of Norsemen, welcome him with feasts, with mead flowing like rivers. But beyond the noise of celebration, Ibn Fadlan is taken to witness a burial, a ritual that reveals everything about the dark role of women in this world. A chieftain has died, and his ship is prepared for the flames. Treasures are placed upon it, silks, weapons, animals. But then comes the part that Ibn Fadlan describes with trembling clarity, the sacrifice of a slave girl, chosen to follow her master into death. Twist. She is not forced outright. Instead, she is asked, "Will you go with your master?" And when she agrees, her fate is sealed. She is lifted onto shoulders, paraded through the camp, forced to drink intoxicating brews, and led into tents where men lie with her as a final ritual. Ibn Fadlan records it all. She is lifted above a wooden frame, her body trembling, her words repeating like a chant. "I see my master in paradise, and he calls to me." But was it faith, or was it coercion masked in ceremony? Imagine her for a moment. A girl perhaps no older than 17, her wrists stained with ink from protective runes drawn by a seeress. She has no choice, not truly. To refuse would mean punishment, humiliation, perhaps torture. To accept means fire and silence. Her body becomes an oath, her death a spectacle of devotion. If you were her, paraded before warriors, promised an afterlife beside your master, would you have chosen defiance, knowing the torment it would bring, or submission, knowing it would end in flames? The seeress plays her role here too. Ibn Fadlan describes an older woman called the Angel of Death, who guides the ritual. She gives the girl intoxicants, whispers words of power, and finally is the one to kill her. A woman killing another woman, but not by choice. The seeress is bound by her duty to the gods, to the community, to the oath of ritual. Blood drips from her hands, but she is revered. She is the bridge between mortal and divine. Her role terrifying and sacred all at once. Twist. Women in Viking rituals occupied both extremes. They were revered as vulvas, prophetesses who carried staffs of power, whose words could halt armies and shape destiny. But they were also silenced as sacrifices, stripped of agency. Their deaths turned into offerings to Odin, Freya, or the spirits of the dead. The line between power and victimhood was razor-thin. Picture a Viking feast hall on the eve of such a ritual. The warriors drink and boast, the fire crackles, but in the corner, A veiled woman sits in silence, her staff carved with runes. All eyes turn to her. She will speak the omen. She will decide if the gods demand blood. In that moment, she is more powerful than any king. Yet when the omen points to sacrifice, it is often another woman who must die. The cycle feeds itself, women as both judges and judged, executioners and victims. If you were there, sitting in that hall, listening to the serious murmur runes that sealed a girl's fate, would you have challenged her? Or would you have lowered your gaze, knowing her staff carried the weight of gods? The motif of fire emerges. Fire consumes the ship, fire carries the dead to the other world, but fire also silences the cries of the sacrificed. As the slave girl is laid beside her master, strangled with a rope before the pyre is lit, the flames roar and erase her voice. The crowd cheers, drums beat, and the smoke rises to the sky. She is gone, her name unrecorded, her story buried in Ibn Fadlan's ink, mini-twist. Some scholars argue that Ibn Fadlan exaggerated, that his words were colored by horror. But archaeology tells us otherwise. Graves in Sweden and Denmark contain bodies of women killed violently, buried alongside chieftains. Some bear marks of strangulation, others the silence of knives. The ritual was real. The terror was real, and what of those who refused? What happened to women chosen for sacrifice who resisted? The sagas are quiet, but the silence speaks volumes. Refusal likely meant humiliation, torture, perhaps being branded as cursed. Better to accept the role, to drink the intoxicants, to whisper of paradise, than to be remembered as one who denied the gods. Resistance was a fate worse than fire. Imagine the cold dawn after the ritual. The ship now ash, the river filled with smoke. The villagers return to their halls, satisfied that the gods have been honored. But in the silence that follows, what remains of the girl? Nothing but whispers, smoke, and the faint memory of her eyes staring at the sky before the rope tightened. If you were her mother, watching in the crowd, powerless, would you tell her story in secret, passing it down in lullabies, or would you bury it, fearing the wrath of the gods and the men who served them? The recurring motif settles in. Women in Viking ritual were fire, blood, and silence. Fire as offering, blood as oath, silence as the final word. They embodied devotion, defiance, prophecy, and sacrifice, roles that terrified even those who carried them out. As chapter 1 closes, Ibn Fadlan's voice echoes across centuries. He saw what others did not dare to write. He recorded what chroniclers in Europe ignored. He left us the image of a young woman sacrificed to fire, guided by another woman with blood-stained hands. A ritual both sacred and cruel, a truth both mesmerizing and horrifying. Because what comes next, in the sagas of Iceland, the courts of Norway, the burning temples of Uppsala, will show that women in Viking ritual were not only sacrificed but woven into oaths. Their bodies the currency of devotion and terror. The sagas of Iceland are often told as stories of men, warriors clashing with axes, poets boasting in halls, explorers steering longships into unknown seas. But if you listen closely, if you read between the lines carved into vellum, another current flows beneath the surface. It is the story of women woven into rituals of fire, blood, and oath. Their roles so vital that without them, the Viking world would have collapsed into silence. And yet, these roles carried a price far darker than any feast or celebration. The Icelandic sagas, written down centuries after the Viking Age, remember women as oath keepers, curse-bearers, and voices of the gods. They were the ones who swore binding words over horns of mead, the ones who carried staffs of prophecy, the ones who demanded blood when honor was broken. But these same women, when they resisted the structures of oath and ritual, became victims of the very laws they upheld. The sagas are full of their echoes, half-remembered, but terrifying once you realize what they mean. Take the story of Hallgard, H. Skaldstad. Remembered in Unjail's saga, she is described as beautiful, proud, and dangerous. A woman whose words sparked feuds that burned across Iceland. At a feast, she and another woman, Bergthora, insult one another, and those words ripple outward until dozens of men are dead in the blood feuds that follow. But here is the twist. Their exchange was not idle gossip. It was ritual, binding in the way of Viking honor. When Hallgard mocked Bergthora, she was making a public challenge. When Bergthor responded, she sealed the oath. From that moment, death had to follow, not mini-twist. In Viking culture, words were as dangerous as swords. For women, this meant their tongues could be weapons, but also nooses. A woman who cursed could unleash vengeance. But if she refused to curse, if she denied the blood oath when it was demanded, she could be punished as a betrayer of her kin. Silence, for a Viking woman, was not always safety. It could be treason. Picture an Icelandic hall during winter. The snow howls outside, the fire crackles low. Men sit with their weapons, but it is the women who stand, their voices sharp. A quarrel erupts over honor. One woman slams her hand against the high seat, her bracelets clanging like chains, and calls upon the gods for vengeance. The other spits a reply, her eyes gleaming in firelight. The hall falls silent. Everyone knows what has just been spoken cannot be taken back. Women's words have set the course, and blood must be spilled. If you were one of those men, watching your fate sealed by two women's words, would you obey the oath, marching toward inevitable death? Or would you break it, risking exile, dishonor, and the wrath of both gods and kin? The sagas are also filled with seeresses, women who guided rituals of prophecy. One of the most haunting is the Völuspa, the prophecy of the seeress, a poem that frames the entire Norse mythological universe. In it, a Volva, or prophetess, speaks to Odin himself, recounting the birth of the world, the rise of gods, and the doom of Ragnar. But what the poem does not say outright is that, in real life, such prophetesses were feared and revered in equal measure. Archaeological finds in Iceland and across Scandinavia reveal graves of women buried with staffs, carved rods of power, adorned with metal knobs, and sometimes with pouches of herbs. These were not ordinary women. These were ritual specialists, able to summon visions, demand sacrifices, and bind men with their words. Mini-twist. In Eric's saga, Roa, the saga of Eric the Red, we find one of the most detailed accounts of such a seeress. Her name is Thorbjorg, the little prophetess. She is described as wearing a blue cloak adorned with stones, her staff topped with brass and inlaid with gems. When she enters the hall, she is given the high seat, honored above all others. She asks for a special ritual to be performed, a chanting called Viking, and who must sing it? A Christian woman named Gudrid, reluctant, ashamed. But the seeress insists. When Gudrid sings, the spirits come, and Thorbjorg speaks her prophecy. Here, women's voices literally summon fate. But what happens when a woman refuses? What if Gudrid had said no? What if a seeress was denied her ritual? Silence could break the ceremony, and with it, the fragile balance of fate. In some cases, refusal was treated as rebellion against the gods themselves. The sagas hint at women mocked, shamed, or even attacked when they resisted their ritual duties. Picture this scene, a hall lit only by torches. The prophetess seated high, her staff gleaming. She demands song. The women of the household tremble, their voices catching. One refuses, crossing herself, whispering prayers to the Christian God. The seeress eyes narrow. The room goes silent. In that silence hangs the weight of doom. To refuse is not just personal defiance. It is a curse upon the whole community. Who will bear the punishment? If you were that Christian woman, knowing your refusal could condemn everyone, would you sing the pagan song, betraying your faith, or stay silent, risking wrath and exile? Many twist. Iceland's conversion to Christianity around the year 1000 brought this tension to a breaking point. Women had been central to pagan rituals, summoning, cursing, sacrificing. But as the new faith spread, their roles became dangerous. To continue practicing prophecy was to risk charges of witchcraft. Suddenly, women who had been revered as seeresses became targets. The silence that followed the conversion was not just religious, it was the silencing of women, whose voices had once bound men's fates. The motif of blood runs through these sagas too. Oaths were often sealed with sacrifice. Animals slaughtered, blood sprinkled on idols, sometimes even human blood demanded. Women were not always the ones killed, but they were often the ones whose voices demanded the blood in the first place. A wife urging her husband to avenge an insult, a mother demanding her son spill blood for honor. If the man refused, the woman's shame could destroy him. If he obeyed, the blood spilled in her name. In this way, women became both the keepers and the instigators of ritual violence. And yet, when they resisted these roles, they became victims. Saga after saga tells of women silenced with exile, or worse, when they refused to demand blood. They were accused of weakness, of betraying kin, of siding with enemies. Silence was a weapon turned back on them. As chapter 2 closes, imagine an Icelandic night. The aurora flickers above. The hall glows with dim fire. Inside, words are spoken, oaths sworn, curses cast. Women's voices echo loudest, demanding vengeance, weaving prophecy, binding men to blood. But outside, in the snow, a figure sits alone, her mouth shut. She has refused to speak the curse. Her silence is deafening. And everyone knows it will bring disaster, because what comes next in Norway's temples of Uppsala, where sacrifices turned entire villages into theatres of terror, will show that women's roles in ritual did not stop with words. Their bodies themselves became the offerings, bound in oaths of fire and blood that no saga dared fully record. The year is 1070. And a German chronicler named Adam of Bremen sets down words that will echo through centuries. He has never been to Uppsala, the great pagan temple of the Swedes, but he writes what witnesses tell him every 9 years. A festival of blood unfolds, where men, animals, and sometimes women are sacrificed to Odin, Thor, and Freya. The temple itself gleams with gold, its walls adorned with idols, its grove thick with bodies hanging from trees. In the heart of this terror, women are not absent. They are both revered and destroyed, their lives woven into the ritual theatre of fire and blood. Mini-twist. Adam writes that, alongside the men sacrificed, dogs and horses are also hung, and even humans, 9 of each kind. Some scholars dismiss this as Christian exaggeration, but archaeology has unearthed graves near Uppsala where human bones show ritual slaughter, throats cut, skulls split. Among them are women. Their deaths are not accidents of war, but acts of worship. Their blood becomes the currency of oaths. Picture the temple at Uppsala on the night of sacrifice. Torches flicker. The air is thick with smoke and pine resin. Crowds gather, their faces painted with ash. At the center stand the idols, Odin with his spear, Thor with his hammer, Freya with his great phallus, symbolizing fertility. Beneath them, animals low nervously, tied to posts, and among them, human figures, hands bound. A woman's hair shines in the torchlight. She is noble, her dress of fine wool embroidered with silver thread. But tonight, she is not honored. She is an offering. If you were in that crowd, staring at her face as the priests raise the blade, would you pray for her release, or would you avert your eyes, fearing the god's wrath for your compassion? Women at Uppsala were not always the ones sacrificed. Some held roles as priestesses or attendants. Their duty was to sprinkle blood on idols, on worshippers, on walls. The sagas call this lotsboli, the sacrificial bowl from which blood was smeared to seal oaths. Imagine a young woman, her arms shaking as she dips the branch into the bowl, flicking warm blood across the golden statue of Freya around her. Men cheer, their oaths binding them to vengeance, to loyalty, to death. The blood she scatters is not hers, but one day it may be. Bot-mini-twist. The motif of fire returns. At Uppsala, bonfires roared, their flames consuming offerings of food, weapons, and sometimes people. Fire was the bridge between the mortal and divine, but it was also the eraser of names. Once a body burned, no trace remained but ash. Women who resisted sacrifice may have been thrown into flames alive, their cries drowned by chants. Adam hints at this, writing of a grove so sacred that even a single twig may not be broken. Sacred, but filled with corpses. Fire and silence, together again. But what of those who refused the ritual? What of the women who resisted becoming priestesses, who refused to handle the blood? The sources are silent, but silence itself is telling. Refusal was not an option. In a world where oath and ritual bound community, resistance was rebellion against gods and kin. The punishment would have been exile, humiliation, or sacrifice itself. Better to obey, to raise the bowl, to dip the branch, than to feel the rope tighten around your throat. Picture a winter night in Uppsala. Snow falls, muffling the screams. Women walk among the bodies, sprinkling blood, whispering oaths. One woman pauses, her eyes fixed on a girl bound to the altar. Their gazes lock. In that moment, both know the truth. Today, the gods demand her. Tomorrow, they may demand me. If you were her, holding the bloodied branch, would you continue the ritual, sealing another's fate, or would you drop it, defying the gods and risking your own? Mini-twist, modern archaeology uncovers bog bodies across Scandinavia, men and women, preserved in peat, their throats slit, their hands bound. Some are centuries older than the Viking age, remnants of earlier ritual traditions. Yet the continuity is clear. Women's bodies had long been offerings, vessels of blood for gods, of fertility, war, and death. The Vikings inherited this, and at Uppsala perfected it into a theatre of terror, and not all women were sacrificed unwillingly. Some may have volunteered, believing death in ritual brought honor, that joining the gods ensured immortality. But how many volunteered freely, and how many were pressured, coerced, silenced, until their only answer was yes? Ibn Fadlan's slave girl echoes here. A choice offered, but not truly a choice. Consent blurred by ritual, survival erased by fire. The Christian chroniclers emphasize the horror. To them, paganism was cruelty, barbarism. But look closer, and the rituals tell a story of power. Women's roles were not only as victims. As priestesses, they wielded authority that rivaled kings. To sprinkle blood was to seal oaths, to hold lives in balance. A woman with a bowl of blood could shape the fate of her people. Power and peril bound together as chapter 3 closes. Imagine the temple at dawn. The fires smolder, the grove is silent. Bodies hang from branches, swaying in the wind. The crowd disperses, leaving only the idols staring down with blank eyes. Among the dead, a woman swings, her hair tangled, her face serene. Was she a priestess punished, a queen defiant, a slave sacrificed? We will never know. Her silence is absolute, because what comes next in the Viking world of household rituals, where women conducted sacrifices in private halls and whispered oaths over fires at night, will show that even away from temples, even in their own homes, women could not escape the pull of blood, fire, and silence. The temple at Uppsala was the grand stage, fire roaring, blood spilling, the eyes of the whole community fixed on the spectacle of sacrifice. But most of Viking life did not unfold under golden idols or sacred groves. It played out in households, in farmsteads scattered across fjords and valleys, in smoky longhouses where the crackle of hearth fires mingled with whispers of the gods. And here 2 women carried the burden of ritual, away from the feasts, away from the great temples. The domestic sphere was a theatre of fire, blood, and silence, mini-twist. Archaeology has shown that nearly every Viking household had its own sacred corner. A small shrine called a hergar or vi. These were not vast temples, just stones piled in the yard, or a carved wooden idol placed by the hearth. Offerings of food, drink, and sometimes blood were made there. And who tended these shrines? Often it was the women of the household. They were the keepers of fire, the sacrifices of animals, the whisperers of oaths spoken not before a crowd but in the silence of night. Picture a Viking longhouse in Iceland. Smoke coils through the rafters, the air heavy with the scent of pine resin and cooking meat. Children sleep in straw beds. Men lie snoring after a day of labor. Only one figure stirs, the matriarch of the house, her hair loose, her face pale in the flickering firelight. She kneels before a small idol carved of oak, a bowl of blood in her lap. She dips her fingers, smearing blood across the wood, whispering names, her husband's, her son's, the ancestors who came before. This is not spectacle, it is survival. She is binding her family to the gods. If you were her, alone in that silent hall, would you whisper those oaths willingly, or would you hesitate, knowing the gods demand blood in return? Mini-twist. Not all blood in household ritual came from animals. Some sagas hint at darker offerings, drops of human blood, sometimes drawn from women themselves. A cut finger, a pricked arm, the blood smeared across an idol to seal an oath. This was not sacrifice unto death, but it blurred the line. Women's bodies became the ink of vows, their blood the binding force. In a world where honor was everything, their veins were scrolls on which oaths were written. Think of Gudrun, Overstoter, in Laxdela saga, who swore vengeance after her husband's death. She washed his bloody garments, then declared that she would not rest until his death was avenged. Her ritual act of washing became a curse. Her words were binding, and her sons were compelled to act. A woman's domestic ritual, in the silence of a hall, became the spark that lit feuds consuming dozens of lives. Picture her, Gudrun, standing in her smoky longhouse, water dripping from the bloodied cloth, her eyes burning as she speaks her vow. Around her, silence falls. Everyone knows what must follow. Her words are as heavy as any sword. If you were her son, listening to her vow, would you take up your weapon, bound by her blood-soaked ritual? Or would you refuse, breaking not only your oath, but your bond with your mother? Mini twist. Household rituals were also where women invoked the hidden world, the spirits of land and ancestors. Women called upon Desia, female guardian spirits tied to family and fate. Sacrifices to the Desia were often led by women, sometimes with offerings of food and drink, sometimes with blood. In some accounts, these sacrifices included the drowning of animals, their blood spilled into the earth. Was this the echo of older traditions, where women themselves were drowned as offerings to lakes and bogs? Archaeology suggests it. Bog bodies of women, bound and submerged, whisper of rituals stretching back centuries. And what of silence? The silence of secrets. Women were often the ones who kept knowledge of curses, of hidden rites, of charms whispered into the fire. A wife might slip runes beneath her husband's pillow, muttering spells to protect him or to doom him. The sagas accuse women of sorcery when misfortune strikes, blaming them for rituals unseen. Sometimes these accusations led to exile, or worse. Silence was survival. To admit knowledge of ritual was to risk charges of witchcraft. And yet, silence itself could condemn. For a woman who refused to act when ritual was demanded was seen as betraying her kin. Picture a young wife accused by her neighbors of sorcery. A child has died, a harvest failed. They whisper that she performed secret rituals by the hearth. She protests her innocence, but the silence around her grows heavy. Her husband looks away. The community demands judgment. If you were her, would you confess to rituals you never performed, hoping to appease them? Or would you keep silent, risking exile into the frozen wilderness? Mini twist. Fire, again, becomes both sacred and terrifying. The hearth was the center of domestic life, tended by women. But fire was also the weapon used against them when accused of witchcraft. Burned at the stake, the punishment Europe would later perfect in witch trials has its roots in the fear of women's ritual power. What better way to silence the keepers of fire than to consume them with it? The recurring motif deepens. Fire as offering, blood as oath, silence as punishment. Women in the household carried all three, often in solitude, with no chronicler to record them. The sagas tell only fragments, glimpses of women whispering over idols, cursing over garments, accused in courts of sorcery. But in those fragments lies a truth. Women were not only part of Viking ritual, they were its heart, its unseen pulse, its hidden danger. As chapter 4 closes, imagine a winter night. A longhouse creaks in the wind. Inside, a woman kneels by the hearth, her face lit by fire, her hands stained with blood from a sacrifice. She whispers names into the smoke, her voice trembling. No one will ever write her story. No one will ever remember her vow. But the gods heard, the ancestors listened, and the fate of her family is sealed. Because what comes next in the sagas of revenge, in the courts of kings, in the trials of women accused of wielding power to dot, will show that the line between revered ritual and condemned witchcraft was perilously thin. And when women crossed it, the terror that followed was worse than silence. By the late Viking age, the landscape of the north was changing. Crosses began to rise where idols once stood. Bells rang over villages where drums had beaten for sacrifice, and priests carried parchment where seeresses once carried staffs. But beneath this new order, something darker smouldered. For centuries, women had been central to ritual, sprinkling blood, whispering oaths, guiding visions. Now, those same women became suspect. What had been sacred prophecy became sorcery. What had been respected sacrifice became witchcraft. And what had once given women power now marked them for terror. Twist. In Iceland's law codes, we see it clearly. The Georges, written after the conversion around the year 1000, contains strict rules against seer, the old magic of prophecy and ritual. And who was most often accused of practicing it? Women, seeresses, widows, wives with knowledge of charms. The rituals they had once performed openly in halls and temples now had to be hidden. If discovered, they faced exile, flogging, or death. Picture a windswept Icelandic thing, an open-air court where chieftains gather. The crowd buzzes with tension. A woman is dragged forward, her hair unkempt, her eyes blazing. She is accused of Fialkingi witchcraft. The accuser points to misfortunes, cattle dying, storms wrecking ships, feuds erupting after her curses. Once, her words would have been respected, even obeyed. Now they are poison. The crowd demands judgment. If you were her, standing before that assembly, would you deny everything, knowing your silence could damn you, or confess, hoping to soften their wrath? Twist. Witchcraft trials in Scandinavia are often remembered from the later medieval period, but their seeds lay here in the Viking twilight. Saga after saga preserves the memory of women punished for ritual. In Eric's saga Rawa, a seeress is honored, but by the time Christianity takes root, women like her are branded as witches. In Untold's saga, a woman named Hrtr's wife is accused of cursing with carved runes. The punishment: the runes are scraped away, and she is humiliated publicly. Her power turned into shame. The motif of blood returns. Trials often demanded ordeals, plunging hands into boiling water, carrying hot iron. Women accused of ritual had to prove innocence by enduring these tests without injury. Imagine the pain, the skin blistering, the crowd watching. A woman's body became both the site of accusation and the proof of her innocence or guilt. Blood became the verdict. Picture a young woman accused of witchcraft, her hands trembling as she lifts glowing iron from the fire. She walks 3 steps, drops it, her palms seared. Days later, when the wounds are examined, they are festering. The judges declare her guilty. She is exiled into the frozen wilds. The people turn away. Her silence becomes her only companion. If you were her mother, watching helplessly, would you cry out against the injustice, or stay silent, fearing the same fate? Twist. Not all accusations came from fear of sorcery. Some were political. Powerful women, widows of chieftains, became threats. To brand them as witches was to strip them of power. The sagas whisper of this women accused of dark rituals, not because they performed them, but because their influence was too great. Chains, fire, silence, the same tools used for centuries against defiant queens, now turned against ritual women, and fire once again became the ultimate terror. Christian chroniclers tell of women burned for sorcery in Norway and Sweden. Flames that once carried sacrifices to the gods now consumed the bodies of those accused of serving them. The hearth, once the domain of women, became the pyre of their destruction. Picture a coastal village at dusk, the tide pulling back as villagers gather round a stake. A woman is tied, her hair whipping in the wind. She once led rituals in her hall, calling on the seer for protection. Now she is condemned as a witch. The flames crackle, smoke rises, and her screams are swallowed by the sea. If you were there, standing among the crowd, would you have whispered her name in prayer, preserving her memory, or turned away, letting silence erase her? Mini twist. Yet even in the face of persecution, fragments of the old rituals endured. Women continued to whisper charms in secret, to hide staffs beneath floors, to teach daughters the songs of protection. Archaeologists have uncovered staffs buried deliberately, hidden, not discarded, suggesting women concealed them from Christian eyes. The silence of burial was an act of defiance, a promise that the old ways would not die entirely. The motif deepens. Fire as punishment, blood as proof, silence as survival. In trials and accusations, women bore the full weight of ritual's dark legacy. What had once elevated them now destroyed them. And yet their whispers endured, their presence haunting the sagas, their shadows lingering in laws and legends. As chapter 5 closes, imagine a windswept Icelandic coast. The tide crashes against black rock. A staff lies buried beneath the earth, hidden by trembling hands centuries ago. Above it, the wind howls with voices long silenced. Women who once commanded ritual, now remembered only in fragments, in accusations, in fear. Because what comes next? The end of the Viking Age, the dawn of kingdoms, and the rewriting of history will show how the terror and silence imposed on ritual women shaped not only memory, but the very way Europe chose to remember its past. The sagas end, the ink dries, and the Viking Age fades into memory. Longships rot, temples crumble, and the gods of the north fall silent under the weight of the cross. But one thing does not vanish so easily. The memory of women in ritual, distorted, feared, silenced, and yet impossible to erase. The final act of this story is not their death, but the way history chose to remember, or rather forget, them. Mini-twist. By the 13th century, when Christian scribes in Iceland wrote down the sagas, the old rituals had already been outlawed for centuries. The voices of seeresses, priestesses, and sacrificial victims no longer rang in halls or groves, but their shadows lingered. The scribes twisted them, reshaped them, turning once revered figures into witches, dangerous seductresses, or omens of doom. What had been sacred became sinister. What had been power became poison. Picture a monk hunched over vellum in a cold scriptorium. His quill scratches as he copies tales told by grandmothers at firesides. But where those women once spoke with reverence of a seeress, he adds venom. He calls her witch, sorceress, dangerous. The narrative bends, reshaping memory. Future generations will not know her as priestess. They will only know her as a warning. If you were that monk, hand trembling as you wrote, would you have preserved her truth, risking the wrath of the church, or obeyed your training, burying her beneath words of fear. The motif of silence becomes most haunting here. Women who once shaped oaths are absent from chronicles. When they appear, it is only as shadows, unnamed, half-remembered, accused. The silence is deliberate. It is a weapon used to strip them from history. But silence cannot fully kill memory. Fragments remain, mini-twist. Archaeology gives them back to us. Graves of women buried with staffs, with amulets, with bowls of blood ritual. Seeresses laid to rest like queens, their status undeniable. One grave in Firecat, Denmark, revealed a woman with an iron staff, owl feathers, henbane seeds, tools of ritual magic. She was buried with honor, not shame. Yet no saga remembers her name. Silence in text, but truth in earth. Picture her grave as it is uncovered, soil crumbling from ancient artifacts. The staff gleams, the seeds whisper of visions, the owl feathers still fragile after 1,000 years. She was once a woman of power, guiding rituals of fire and blood. History tried to erase her, but the earth refused. If you stood at that excavation, holding her staff, would you feel awe at her forgotten power, or grief at the silence imposed on her memory? Mini-twist. Folklore carried whispers the scribes could not fully erase. In remote valleys, people told stories of huldras, hidden women who lured men into forests, of witches who cursed cattle, of wise women who healed with herbs and whispered charms over fire. These figures were distortions, but they carried the DNA of something older, the memory of women who once led rituals, who bound communities with oaths, who demanded blood for honor, demonized but not forgotten. And then there is myth. In the poetic Edda, recorded by Christian hands but echoing older songs, women appear again and again as seeresses, fates, and goddesses tied to sacrifice. The Norns, spinning destiny at the roots of the Volva who prophesies, Freya who receives half of the dead in battle. These were not passive figures. They were keepers of blood, demanders of oaths, receivers of sacrifice. Myth preserved what history tried to bury. Picture the great tree Yggdrasil, roots spreading into darkness, branches into light. At its base, women sit, weaving fate with threads of blood. Every oath sworn, every sacrifice made, every scream silenced, all are threads in their loom. They are eternal, even if their names are lost. If you were before them, watching them weave your fate, would you beg them to change your thread, or accept their silent judgment? The motif of fire, blood, and silence comes full circle. Fire consumed women's bodies in sacrifice and in punishment, but also kept their whispers alive in hearth rituals. Blood-bound oaths demanded vengeance, punished defiance, and gave women both power and doom. Silence erased their names, but silence itself became a scream, echoing through sagas, archaeology, and myth.mini-twist. Their legacy shaped not only Viking memory, but Europe itself. The fear of women's ritual power fueled centuries of witch trials. From Scandinavia to Salem, the image of the dangerous, blood-soaked sorceress came directly from the memory of seeresses and sacrificial women of the Viking Age. What had once been sacred roles became Europe's most feared archetype. The terror endured long after the rituals ended. As Chapter 6 closes, imagine the ruins of a Viking hall. The fire is cold, the idols are gone, the walls collapse into earth. But in the soil beneath, a staff lies buried, a bowl cracked, an amulet broken. The woman who held them is gone, her name silenced, yet her shadow remains. We feel it when we tell sagas, when we dig graves, when we whisper myths. And here is the forbidden truth. The Viking Age was not built only on warriors, swords or kings' crowns. It was shaped by women in ritual, women who carried fire, spilled blood, endured silence. Their power was both revered and feared, their fate both sacred and terrifying. And though history tried to erase them, their legacy endures in whispers, in artifacts, in myths that refuse to die. Because even now, when we speak of Vikings, when we tell stories of feasts and battles, the shadows of those women flicker in the firelight. They are still here. They have always been here. And they remind us that history is never just what is written, it is also what is silenced.